The grease on the oven door was from a roast Mitchell had demanded 3 days ago. But as I wiped it away, I realized my fingers were too stiff to press down hard enough to clear the smudge. It remained there, a dull, cloudy fingerprint on the glass. Behind me, the television in the den was playing a golf tournament. Mitchell wasn't actually watching. He was sitting at the kitchen island, his iPad propped against a loaf of soured bread I had baked yesterday morning. He didn't look up when I rinsed the yellow sponge under the tap. The water ran lukewarm because the water heater in the basement had begun to fail 3 weeks ago. Its slow, metallic rattle, a constant rhythm underneath our conversations. "Curtis called while you were out at the pharmacy," Mitchell said. His voice had the flat, administrative tone he used when he was delivering messages he considered beneath his attention span. "He wants to know if you can watch the kids next weekend. He and Brenda have some retreat in the mountains, some corporate thing." "Next weekend is the dentist," I said softly, keeping my back to him as I squeezed the sponge. "The crown on the lower left." I told him that on Tuesday. "He said they already booked the cabin, Lorraine." Mitchell tapped his screen, his thumbnail making a sharp click against the glass. "You can reschedule the dentist. It's just a cleaning, isn't it?" "It's a crown," I said. "The tooth is cracked." Mitchell let out a short, dry breath through his nose. It wasn't a laugh. It was the sound of a man who had spent 34 years treating his wife's physical ailments as minor logistical complications. "Well, call them back and figure it out. He's your son. He shouldn't have to scramble because of a tooth." He reached for his coffee mug. It was empty. He didn't ask me to fill it, but he set it down 3 inches closer to my side of the counter, his fingers lingering on the ceramic handle for a second before he pulled his hand back. It was an old gesture, a silent cue I had answered its 10,000 times without thinking. This time I left the sponge in the sink and stood there, looking at the empty mug. "Did you hear me?" he asked, still looking at his screen. "I heard you, Mitchell." "You look tired today," he remarked, his tone shifting into that polite, clinical condescension he wore like an old jacket. He finally looked up, his eyes scanning my face, noting the gray at my temples that I hadn't dyed in 6 months, the wet vault my shoulders sloped under my faded cardigan. "You should put some color on your face. You look like a ghost standing by that sink." I looked down at my hands. They were dry, the skin around the knuckles red and thin. "I am 58 years old, Mitchell." "I know how old you are," he said, turning back to his iPad. "I'm just saying, you let yourself go, and then you wonder why you feel sluggish. You're lucky we've got history, Lorraine. At your age, with that hip and that attitude, no one else is going to choose you again. You've got to keep up." He said it without anger. That was the part that remained in the room, long after the television in the den went quiet. He said it as if he were stating a law of physics, a simple, undeniable truth about my market value as a human being. Some people think emotional damage comes from shouts and broken plates, but the worst kind is quiet. It is the steady, daily drip of being told you are barely tolerated, delivered by the person who promised to hold your hand until the end. I didn't reply. I picked up his empty mug, carried it to the sink, and set it down. I didn't wash it. I just left it there, a dark ring of dried coffee staining the white porcelain bottom. On Sunday, the house smelled of roasted garlic and rosemary. Sylvia arrived first, her heels clicking aggressively on our hardwood floors. She didn't kiss my cheek. She simply handed me her coat, a heavy camel-colored wool coat that smelled of expensive perfume and city air, without looking at me. "Is Dad in the den?" she asked, already heading toward the hallway. "I need him to look at the paperwork for the condo. The association is trying to raise the assessment fee again, and he knows how to handle these people." "He's in the yard," I said, catching the sleeve of her coat before it slipped from my arms. "He's looking at the gutters." "Great." She didn't pause. She walked right past the dining room table, where I had spent an hour setting out the good linen napkins, the ones my mother had given us for our wedding, the ones I had spent Friday night starching and ironing. A mother's life is often measured in these invisible hours. The hours spent preparing for people who will enter your home, eat your food, use your bathroom, and leave without ever once asking how you slept the night before. Curtis arrived 20 minutes later, his 2 young children trailing behind him like small, chaotic storms. Brenda wasn't with him. "She had a migraine," he said, though I knew from the tone of his voice that they had argued in the car on the way over. "Mom, can you take their jackets?" Curtis said, nudging his 6-year-old Leo toward me. "And Leo hasn't eaten lunch." He was cranky in the car. "Do you have those little cheese crackers he likes?" "I don't," I said, hanging Sylvia's coat in the closet. "I have some sliced apples and some cheddar." Curtis frowned, his eyebrows drawing together in a small, sharp line that looked exactly like his father's. "He doesn't like sliced apples unless they're peeled, Mom. You know that. Just peel them real quick." "He can eat them with the skin, Curtis," I said, my voice quiet, almost lost under the noise of the television, from the den where Mitchell and Sylvia were already arguing about property taxes. "The skin has the vitamins." Curtis sighed, a heavy, performative sound of frustration. "Never mind. I'll just find something in the pantry." "You always make things more complicated than they need to be." He brushed past me, his shoulder hitting mine slightly as he moved into the kitchen. I stood in the hallway for a moment, the front door still slightly ajar, letting in the damp October air. The wind was pulling the last yellow leaves from the maple tree in the front yard. They fell silently, sticking to the wet asphalt of the driveway. At the dinner table, I sat at the end, nearest the kitchen, so I could jump up every time someone needed more gravy, more water, or another napkin. "So," Mitchell said, clearing his throat and looking at Curtis, "I talked to Gordon at the firm. He says the transitions is going smoothly. My retirement dinner is set for the second Friday of next month." "Are you going to do the speech?" Sylvia asked, her mouth full of potato. "Of course he is," Curtis said. "Dad's the senior partner. They're giving him the bronze plaque. They wanted to make sure we had the guest count locked in," Mitchell said, looking down at his plate. "I told them 4. Myself, Curtis, Brenda, and Sylvia." The dining room went very quiet, though the children were still clinking their forks against their plates. I set my water glass down. The ice cubes clinked against the side. "4, Mitchell?" Mitchell didn't look up immediately. He cut a piece of roast beef, his knife scraping against the ceramic. "Well, Lorraine, it's a late dinner. Downtown at the Union Club." You know how you get with those late city drives. Your eyes aren't what they used to be. And frankly, the conversation is going to be mostly tax law and restructuring. You'd be bored to tears. I was there when you joined the firm, Mitchell, I said. My voice didn't shake, but it felt thin like old paper. I made the finger sandwiches for the open house in '92. I washed the paint off your hands when you renovated the first office on Fifth Avenue. That was 30 years ago, Mom, Sylvia said, her voice dripping with a superficial sympathy that felt worse than a slap. Things are different now. It's mostly younger associates and their clients. It's more of a networking event than a family thing. Dad's just trying to save you the hassle. Exactly, Mitchell said, finally looking up. His eyes were cold, steady, and entirely devoid of regret. I didn't think you'd want to buy a new dress anyway. You haven't bought anything like that in years. I looked around the table. Curtis was busy cutting Leo's meat, his face completely neutral. Sylvia was looking at her phone under the edge of the table. My children, the ones I had carried, the ones whose fevers I had watched through the small hours of the night, while Mitchell slept peacefully in the next room, didn't even raise their eyes. They had already erased me. I stood up from the table. I'll get the pie, I said. Make sure you warm it up, Mitchell called out after me. And see if we have any of that vanilla bean ice cream left. I walked into the kitchen. The light from the window was fading, casting long gray shadows across the linoleum. I didn't turn on the overhead light. I stood by the counter, my hands resting on the cool laminate, listening to the muffled sound of my family, laughing in the other room. I looked at the cherry pie sitting on the stovetop. I had spent 3 hours crimping the crust on Friday. I didn't put it in the oven. I didn't get the ice cream. Instead, I walked down the hall to the small closet under the stairs where we kept the old suitcases. I stood there in the dark, smelling the dust and the old leather, my heart beating in a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. The family left around 8. Sylvia didn't take her dirty coffee cup back to the kitchen. She left it on the mahogany mantelpiece, right next to the framed photograph of her graduation from Penn State. When I lifted the cup, it left a sticky, dark brown crescent on the polished wood. Curtis' children had left 3 plastic toy cars on the rug and a smear of orange cheese on the arm of the velvet armchair. I didn't clean them up immediately. I just stood in the middle of the quiet living room, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the wind scraping the branches of the maple against the gutters. Where was the pie? Mitchell asked, walking into the room with his empty water glass. He had changed into his flannel pajamas and looked softer, older, but his eyes were still sharp with small, dry irritations. We sat there like fools waiting for dessert. I had to tell Curtis we'd just skip it. The oven took too long to heat, I said. It was a lie, but it was easier than telling him I had spent those 20 minutes sitting on a dusty suitcase in the dark, wondering when I had stopped being a person to him. Mitchell looked at the smear of cheese on the armchair, then looked at me. Well, you should have checked it earlier. It's just like you lately. You lose track of things, Lorraine. The oil change on the wagon is overdue, too. I saw the sticker on the windshield. I'll take it in tomorrow, I said. Make sure you do. I don't need the engine seizing because you forgot." He turned and walked down the hall, his slippers dragging slightly on the hardwood. "Turn the thermostat down to 62 before you come up. No sense in burning oil we don't need." I didn't turn the thermostat down. For the first time in 30 years, I left it at 68. I sat on the edge of the sofa in the dark, my fingers tracing the cold crescent stain on the mantelpiece, until the grandfather clock in the hall struck midnight. On Monday morning, the dentist's office smelled of clove oil and latex. The drill had a high, clean whine that vibrated through my jaw and skull. I kept my eyes fixed on a water stain on the acoustic ceiling tile directly above the chair. It looked vaguely like an island, a small, isolated piece of land surrounded by gray. "You've been grinding your teeth, Lorraine," Dr. Vance said, pulling his mask down around his neck. He was a quiet man, near my age, who had treated my family since Curtis was in middle school. "This crack isn't from food, it's from pressure. You're holding a lot of tension in your jaw." "Is it deep?" I asked, my tongue tracing the rough, temporary filling he had just put in. "Deep enough. I can save the tooth with the crown, but we need to do it before the end of the month. Otherwise, we're looking at a root canal." He tapped his chart. "The office will put it through your insurance, but there's a copay, about $800 for the porcelain." "That's fine," I said, rising from the chair. My hip gave a dull, familiar throb as I straightened my leg. At the front desk, the receptionist, a young girl named Chloe, who always wore her hair in a high, bouncy ponytail, clicked through her computer screen. "All right, Mrs. Miller. I've got you down for the 24th. I tried to run the insurance card we have on file, but it came back with an error code. Has Mitchell's policy changed?" "No," I said, pulling my wallet from my bag. "It should be the same." "Let me try again." She typed quickly, her long lavender nails clicking on the keys. She paused, her smile faltering slightly as she looked at the screen. "Oh. It says the dependent coverage was restricted to emergency dental, only as of the 1st of the month. Did Mitchell switch to the high deductible plan?" I looked at her. The lobby was warm, but a sudden small chill seemed to settle behind my knees. He didn't mention it. "Call the administrator," Chloe said, her voice dropping into that professional, gentle tone people use when they realize they are delivering bad news to someone who doesn't know they are receiving it. Sometimes it's just a clerical error when they do the autumn renewals. "No," I said, my hand closing over the strap of my purse. "Don't call. I'll check with him first. Can I pay the deposit on the joint card?" "Sure." I handed her the blue Visa. She slid it through the reader. The little machine beeped. A short, high-pitched double chirp that I knew before she even looked up. "It's declined, Mrs. Miller," she said softly. "Do you have another card?" I didn't. I had my debit card, which was linked to the household checking account, where Mitchell deposited my weekly grocery allowance. I knew exactly how much was in there. $312. "I'll have to call you back to reschedule, Chloe," I said, taking my cards back. My fingers were trembling, so I tucked them into my coat pockets where she couldn't see. "I think there's been a mistake at the bank." "Of course," she said. She didn't look me in the eye. She looked at her screen, her shoulders shifting in a subtle gesture of embarrassment. People in small towns know each other's business. or at least they think they do. She knew Mitchell was a senior partner at Miller and Vance. She knew he drove a brand new Lexus. And she had just watched his wife of 34 years walk out of the office because her credit card wouldn't clear an $800 dental bill. I didn't drive home. I drove to the First National Bank branch on Main Street. The air inside the bank was heavy with the smell of wet carpets and old paper. Mrs. Gable, a woman who had worked there since my children were in strollers, was sitting behind the low glass partition in the customer service department. She smiled when she saw me, her glasses sliding down her nose. "Lorraine," she said, leaning forward. "How are those grandchildren? Curtis' little boy must be starting first grade now." "He is," sitting in the heavy leather chair across from her desk. "He's growing very fast." "They always do. What can I do for you today?" "Did you need to order more checks for the household account? I saw we ran a batch last month." "I need to check the balance on the savings account," I said. "The primary one, the one we opened when we bought the house on Cedar Lane, Mrs." Gable's fingers hovered over her keyboard. She looked at me, her smile faltering just a fraction of an inch, the way Chloe's had at the dentist's office. "The joint savings. The one ending in 498. "Yes," she typed, her eyes scanning the blue light of the monitor. The silence stretched between us, filled only by the low, steady hum of the heating vent behind her chair. "Lorraine," she said, her voice very quiet. "That account was closed 3 weeks ago." I felt my heart give a single hard thump, like a bird hitting a window pane. "Closed. The funds were deferred," she said, her eyes darting toward the glass office behind her where the branch manager was talking on the phone. "Mitchell came in on the 10th. Since it was a joint account, he had the legal authority to withdraw the balance. He moved the $84,000 into a new investment account." "Am I on that new account?" I asked. Mrs. Gable didn't answer with words. She simply looked at me, her old eyes filled with a soft, heavy pity that made me want to shrink into the leather of the chair. She slowly shook her head. "It's an individual account, Lorraine, under his name and Curtis's name as the transfer on death beneficiary." She reached across the desk, her hand stopping just short of touching my dry knuckles. "I thought you knew. He said it was for the estate planning, for the taxes." "Yes," I lied, my voice steady, though my throat felt like it was full of sand. "Of course I forgot. The estate planning. We've been talking about it so much, I lost track of the dates." "Oh, thank goodness, Mrs." Gable said, letting out a breath she had been holding. For a second I was worried. You know how men get when they start thinking about retirement. They want to organize everything into little boxes. "Yes," I said, standing up. My knees felt loose, as if the joints were made of water. They like their boxes. I walked out of the bank and into the gray October afternoon. The air smelled of rain and diesel exhaust from a school bus idling at the corner. I got into the wagon. I didn't start the engine. I just sat there, my hands on the cold steering wheel, looking at my reflection in the rearview mirror. My hair was gray. My eyes looked small and tired behind my reading glasses. Mitchell was right. No one would choose me again. But as I sat there in the quiet car, listening to the rain begin to patter against the windshield, I realized something else. I didn't need anyone to choose me. I just needed to stop waiting for him to do it. I reached into my glove compartment and pulled out a small, faded blue leather passbook. It was from the commercial bank in my hometown, 3 hours north. It was the account my father had opened for me when I was 18, before he died. There was only $4,000 in it, money from a small life insurance policy I had never touched. Money Mitchell had forgotten existed 30 years ago. I held the small blue book against my chest, feeling the sharp edges of the plastic cover through my coat. When I walked through the back door, the house was warm, but it felt hollow. Mitchell was sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop open. A stack of folders from his firm spread out around his coffee mug. He didn't look up when the screen door clicked shut. He only spoke when I set the car keys on the counter. "Did you get the oil changed?" he asked, his fingers typing a rapid rhythm against the keys. "The shop was busy," I said. "They had a 2-hour wait." "You should have made an appointment, Lorraine. I told you that. Now you'll have to go back tomorrow, and that's another morning wasted." He paused, his typing stopping for a brief second. "Oh, by the way," Curtis called. He said, "You haven't called him back about the kids for next weekend." I hung my coat on the peg by the door. I was at the dentist. Right, the tooth. He finally looked up, squinting slightly, as if trying to remember why we were talking about it. "How much is it going to run?" $800, I said, leaning against the counter. "But the joint card was declined, Mitchell. And Chloe said my dental insurance was canceled at the beginning of the month." Mitchell's expression didn't change. He didn't look guilty or surprised. He simply looked mildly inconvenienced, the way he did when the mail carrier left a package on the porch instead of inside the screen door. "I had to make some adjustments, Lorraine," he said, turning back to his screen. "Since I'm retiring in 3 months, the firm is transitioning my health package. The spousal dental rider was costing us $90 a month for basically nothing. You only go twice a year. I have a cracked tooth, Mitchell. I need a crown. And I'll write a check for it," he said, his voice rising just enough to let me know he considered the discussion closed. "You don't need to get defensive. I'm managing our assets." I moved the cash from the savings account into a trust structure to protect it from probate later. It's standard estate planning. Curtis and I spent 3 hours on it last week. "Curtis knew about it?" I asked. My voice was very quiet now, almost a whisper. "Of course he knew. He's the executor of the estate, Lorraine. If something happens to me, he's the one who has to manage the properties and the pension. You don't want to be dealing with lawyers and liquidations at 70, do you?" He let out a short, dry laugh. "You can barely handle the oil change." There it was. The small casual subtraction of my intelligence. He had spent 30 years convincing me that I was fragile, that my mind wasn't built for numbers, that my only job was to keep the house clean, the pantry stocked, and the children quiet. And I had believed him because it was easier than fighting the slow, heavy weight of his disapproval. "I see," I said. "Just bring me the bill from the dentist when they do the work," he said, his fingers resuming their click-clack on the keyboard. "I'll transfer the funds from the business account and call Curtis. He's stressed out about this weekend." I didn't answer. I walked upstairs to our bedroom, the third step from the top, creaking under my weight. I sat on the edge of the bed and pulled my cell phone from my purse. My fingers were cold as I dialed Curtis's number. It rang 4 times before he picked up. I could hear the sound of his children screaming in the background, the familiar chaos of his kitchen. "Hey, Mom," he said, his voice rushed and tight. "Did you talk to the dentist? Can you watch the kids starting Friday afternoon? Brenda needs to leave by 2 to beat the turnpike traffic." "I can't watch them, Curtis," I said. The background noise seemed to fade as Curtis went quiet. "What do you mean you can't? I told you Brenda and I have this retreat. We've had it booked for months." "I have an appointment on Friday," I said. "Well, reschedule it," he said, his tone shifting instantly from busy to irritated. "It's just the dentist, Mom. You're retired. You have all week to do that stuff. Brenda's mom can't do it because her back is out, and we really need this weekend. We haven't been away alone in a year." "No," I said. "No?" Curtis sounded genuinely shocked. He had never heard that word from me without a long, apologetic explanation attached to it. "What do you mean, no?" "Mom, you're being really selfish here. It's one weekend." "I have spent 34 years keeping your schedule, Curtis," I said, looking at my own reflection in the dark glass of the window. "I watched you when you were sick. I watched your sister. Now I watch your children. But on Friday I have an appointment, and I won't be changing it." "What is wrong with you lately?" he hissed. "Dad said you were acting strange. Is this about the trust? Because if it is, that's just business, Mom. Dad's trying to protect the family money. You don't need to take it out on my kids." "I'm not taking anything out on anyone," I said. "I'm simply telling you that I am unavailable." Before he could answer, I hung up the phone. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a wild, erratic fluttering that made it hard to breathe. I had never hung up on my son before. I had never left him holding an empty dial tone. When you spend decades saying yes to keep the peace, the first time you say no, that feels like a declaration of war to the people who benefit from your silence. They don't see it as a boundary. They see it as a betrayal. 10 minutes later, the bedroom door opened. Mitchell didn't knock. He stood in the doorway, his face dark with an anger that was quiet but heavy. He was holding his phone in his hand. "Curtis just called me," Mitchell said, stepping into the room. "He said you hung up on him." "I told him I couldn't watch the children," I said, keeping my hands flat on my knees so he wouldn't see them shaking. "He said you were rude, Lorraine. He said you brought up the bank accounts." Mitchell walked over to the dresser, his eyes fixed on me in the mirror. "I told you, that money is being managed. It's not for you to use as a weapon against children. You're acting like a child." "I am 58, I said, looking at him through the glass. "And I have $4,000 to my name because you spent 30 years telling me that what was yours was mine until you decided it wasn't." "You have everything you need," Mitchell said, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous register. "You live in this house. You drive my car. You eat the food I buy. Don't start acting like you're some kind of martyr, Lorraine. You haven't worked a day since Curtis was born." "I worked every day in this house," I said. "That's not work," he said dismissively. "That's just living. Now you're going to call Curtis back, and you're going to tell him you'll watch those kids. I'm not going to have my son's marriage suffer because you're having some kind of late-life crisis." He stood there, waiting. For 30 years, this was the moment where I would look at the floor, apologize, and do what he wanted, just to make the heavy, suffocating silence in the house go away. I looked up at him. I didn't look at the floor. "No," I said. Mitchell's eyes narrowed. He looked at me as if he were seeing a stranger sitting in his bedroom. He didn't scream. He just let out a long, slow breath, his mouth twisting into a cold, hard line. "Fine," he said, his voice quiet and deadly, "if that's how you want to play this. But don't expect me to write that check for the dentist. You can pay for your own crown with your little $4,000. Let's see how far that gets you when the car needs tires next month." He turned and walked out, shutting the bedroom door behind him with a soft, deliberate click that sounded like a key turning in a lock. I sat there in the dark. The house was very cold now, the radiator in the corner clicking as the heat died down. I reached into my pocket and felt the blue passbook. The silence in the room wasn't suffocating anymore. It felt clean. The cash was crisp. I had driven to the regional of the commercial bank in Gibson, 20 miles north of our town, where the tellers didn't know Mitchell and didn't know my children. The woman behind the counter had counted out 8 $100 bills, her thumb snapping against the paper with a clean, satisfying sound. At the dentist's office, Dr. Vance worked in silence. The smell of the adhesive was sharp, like vinegar, as he pressed the porcelain crown onto my molar. He held it there with his thumb, his face close to mine. I could see the tiny burst capillaries in his nose, the gray hairs in his eyebrows. He was a man who had lived a life just like me, but his life had left him with a practice, a reputation, and a comfortable house on the hill. My life had left me with a mouthful of temporary fillings and a husband who calculated my worth down to $90 a month. "Bite down," he said, placing a strip of blue carbon paper between my teeth. "Grind a little, left to right." I bit down. The newt tooth felt high, foreign, like a pebble lodged in my jaw. But it was solid. "How does that feel?" he asked, adjusting the light. "It feels real," I said, my voice thick from the anesthesia. At the front desk, I slid the $800 across the counter. Chloe looked at the cash, then at me. Her expression was a mixture of surprise and a strange, quiet respect. "All set, Mrs. Miller," she said, her voice dropping to a murmur. "We'll send the receipt to your home address." "No," I said, leaning against the desk. "Send it to my email, just mine." She nodded quickly, her fingers flying over the keyboard. "Done." I was sitting in my station wagon in the parking lot of the local grocery store when my phone rang. The screen showed Sylvia's name. I let it ring 3 times before I answered. I didn't say hello. I just waited. "Mom?" Sylvia's voice was sharp, accompanied by the background hum of her office. "Are you there?" "I'm here, Sylvia." "Curtis is in an absolute panic," she said, her tone dry and accusatory. "He had to cancel the cabin deposit, and Brenda is furious. They're arguing about who has to stay home with the kids this weekend." "Why are you doing this?" "Dad said you're refusing to help out because of some financial dispute." "Your father canceled my dental insurance, Sylvia, and he closed our joint savings account." There was a pause on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint sound of photocopiers, the quiet murmur of people who had important things to do. "Look," Sylvia said, her voice softening into that patronizing sigh she used when she thought I was being unreasonable. Dad explained that. "It's for tax purposes, Mom. He's trying to protect the estate. You always get so emotional about these things. He's 64 years old and trying to retire from a high-stress job. Do you have any idea how much pressure he's under?" "And what about the pressure I am under?" I asked. My voice was calm, but it felt heavy, like a stone dropping through deep water. "What pressure?" Sylvia laughed, a short, sharp sound. "You don't have a job, Mom. You live in a beautiful 5-bedroom house. You don't have to worry about mortgage payments or health insurance premiums. Dad takes care of all of that. All Curtis asked you to do was watch your own grandchildren for 48 hours. You're retired. Your entire life is free time. My life is not free time, Sylvia. My life has been your time, and your brother's, and your father's." "Oh, please," she said, her voice hardening again. "Don't act like a martyr. You chose to stay home. You wanted that. Now you're throwing some kind of tantrum and hurting the kids because you're mad at Dad. It's incredibly selfish." "I have to go, Sylvia," I said. "Mom, don't you dare hang up on." I pressed the red button. I set the phone on the passenger seat, next to the brown paper bag containing a single loaf of bread and a tin of sardines. A family is a delicate machine. For 30 years, I had been the oil that kept the gears from grinding against each other. I had smoothed over Mitchell's coldness, Curtis's selfishness, and Sylvia's vanity. I had made sure they never had to feel the friction of their own behavior. But when the oil stops flowing, the machine doesn't thank you for its years of smooth operation. It blames you for the breakdown. When I pulled into our driveway, Mitchell's Lexus was gone. The garage door was open. The dark interior of the stalls smelling of damp concrete and old lawnmowers. I parked the wagon, gathered my small bag of groceries, and walked up the back steps. The kitchen was quiet, but the air felt different. It was cold. I set the groceries on the counter and looked at the wall hook next to the pantry where the keys to the station wagon usually hung. The hook was empty. My spare set, which I kept in a small porcelain dish by the microwave, was also gone. I walked down the hall to the small closet under the stairs. My small leather jewelry box, the one my mother had given me for my 16th birthday, sat on the top shelf of the closet. I reached up and pulled it down. The small brass key, which I kept hidden inside an old pill bottle in the medicine cabinet, was already in the lock. I opened the box. My mother's silver engagement ring was there. My grandmother's pearl brooch was there. But the small velvet pocket at the back of the box, the one where I kept my passport and my birth certificate, was empty. I stood there in the quiet closet, the smell of lavender sachet and old wool surrounding me. Mitchell hadn't just taken the car keys to restrict my driving. He had taken my identity. He had taken the documents that proved I existed outside of this house, outside of his name, outside of his marriage. I closed the jewelry box. I didn't cry. The tears had dried up somewhere north of Gibson, somewhere between the bank teller's thumb and the dentist's thumb. I walked back into the kitchen, picked up my phone, and opened my email. There was a message from the dentist's office with the digital receipt for my $800 payment. I forwarded the receipt to Mitchell's business email. Then I sat down at the kitchen table, opened the tin of sardines, and began to eat, my new tooth grinding against the soft, salty meat in a slow, steady rhythm. Mitchell came home at 9. I was sitting in the den with a book in my lap, though I hadn't turned a page in an hour. He didn't come into the room. He went straight to the kitchen, and I heard the clink of the ice dispenser, followed by the heavy amber smell of scotch drifting down the hallway. A moment later, his footsteps stopped at the doorway of the den. He had taken off his suit jacket, his tie loosened, the top button of his white shirt undone. He looked at me, his eyes dark with a mixture of irritation and curiosity. "I saw the emails," he said, taking a sip from his lowball glass. "Where did you get $800, Lorraine?" "I told you. I have my own money." He let out a short, mocking breath. "Your father's little passbook from the 90s? That's what, $4,000? You think that's going to make you independent? You'll burn through that in 2 months just paying for groceries and gas." "I don't have to worry about gas," I said, looking up from my book. "I don't have the keys to the wagon." Mitchell didn't flinch. He leaned against the doorframe, his shoulder resting against the white paint I had rolled on ourselves during the summer of '98. "The wagon is staying in the garage for now. Until you decide to start acting like a partner in this marriage again. You don't need to be driving all over the county making scenes at the bank and the dentist." He waited. He expected me to argue. He expected me to demand my passport back, to cry about his pettiness, to beg him to put things back the way they were. But I didn't. I just looked at him. I noticed the way his chin had begun to sag over his collar, the small, selfish lines around his mouth that I had spent decades trying to pretend were just the marks of a hard-working man. He wasn't a giant. He was just a tired, aging man holding a glass of scotch in a house his wife had kept clean for him. "All right," I said. Mitchell's hand tightened slightly around his glass. My lack of anger was like a wall he hadn't expected to run into. "What does all right mean?" "It means all right, Mitchell. You have the keys. You have the papers. I'm going to finish my chapter now." He stood there for another 10 seconds, his scotch swirling in his glass, before he turned and walked back to the kitchen. A few minutes later, I heard his heavy footsteps going up the stairs, followed by the distant click of the master bedroom door. On Saturday morning, the house was silent. Usually, Saturday was the day of the great domestic rush. I would wake at 6, put a load of whites in the wash, make a pot of coffee, and spend 3 hours ironing Mitchell's shirts for the coming week. 5 cotton dress shirts, starch on the collars, light steam on the sleeves. Then I would prep the kitchen for whatever family lunch or dinner had been scheduled. This morning I woke at 8. I lay in the guest room, the small room at the end of the hall that smelled of cedar and old blankets, and listened to the silence. When I went downstairs, Mitchell was standing in the kitchen, dressed in his charcoal trousers and his undershirt. His face was red, his hair damp from the shower. He was looking into the wicker laundry basket by the pantry. "Lorraine," he said, turning as I entered, "where are my shirts?" "They're in the basket," I said, pouring myself a cup of black coffee. "They aren't ironed," he said, his voice tight. "I have lunch with Curtis and the senior partners at the country club in an hour. I need the blue Oxford. The iron is in the closet, I said, sitting at the table. Mitchell stared at me. I don't iron my own shirts, Lorraine. I've never ironed my own shirts. Then you'll be the only senior partner at the country club, wearing a wrinkled shirt, I said, taking a sip of coffee. It was hot, bitter, and tasted better than any coffee I had made in years. What is wrong with you? He hissed, taking 2 steps toward the table. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides. Are you trying to ruin my retirement? Is that what this is? Some kind of sick revenge because I consolidated the accounts? I've worked 40 years to build a life, and you're acting like a spoiled teenager because you have to ask for a check. You built a life for yourself, Mitchell, I said, my voice steady. I was just the utility that kept it running, and utilities can be turned off. You're being ridiculous, he said, but there was a tremor of genuine unease in his voice now. He wasn't used to a wife who didn't blink. He was used to a wife who apologized for his anger. I'm going to lunch. When I get back, I expect this house to be back to normal. Do you hear me? I hear you, I said. He grabbed a wrinkled shirt from the basket, threw it over his arm, and stormed out of the kitchen. A few minutes later, the front door slammed, and the low, powerful rumble of his Lexus shook the kitchen windows as he backed out of the driveway. Once the sound of his car had faded entirely, I set my coffee cup down. The house was empty. The silence was absolute. I walked down the hall to Mitchell's home office. The door was usually locked, but in his rush to leave for the country club, he had left the brass deadbolt turned, but the latch unclicked. The door yielded to a gentle push of my finger. The room smelled of leather, old paper, and the expensive pipe tobacco he only smoked when he was alone. I walked over to his large mahogany desk, the one he had bought with his first partner draw in '95. I sat in his leather swivel chair. It was too big for me. My feet barely touched the oriental rug beneath the desk. On the corner of the desk sat a thick manila folder labeled M. Miller, Personal Confidential. It wasn't hidden. Mitchell had never felt the need to hide anything from me because he had never believed I had the courage or the intelligence to look. I opened the folder. Inside was a stack of real estate documents. The first page was a purchase agreement for a townhouse in Savannah, Georgia. The property was beautiful. 3 stories, historic brick, overlooking one of the quiet squares near the river. The closing date was December 15th, 1 week after his retirement dinner, but it was the buyer's line that made the air leave my lungs. Buyer, Mitchell T. Miller, an unmarried man. Underneath the purchase agreement was a draft of a separation agreement, prepared by Robert Harris, Mitchell's oldest friend and the head of the family law division at his firm. The agreement was dated for the 2nd week of December. It offered me the house on Cedar Lane, the drafty, 30-year-old suburban house with the failing water heater, and a modest monthly stipend that would expire after 5 years. Everything else, the pension, the investment portfolios, the new townhouse in Savannah, was Mitchell's. At the bottom of the page, in the witness line where a notary would sign, there was a sticky note in Curtis's neat engineering print. Dad looks good, spoke to Robert. He says this is the cleanest way to do it without dragging it through probate. Brenda and I will look at the Savannah listing this weekend. Looks great. See. I sat there in the leather chair, the paper shaking in my hands. My husband wasn't just planning to retire. He was planning to disappear. And my son, the boy I had held in my arms through 3 operations, the boy whose university tuition I had begged Mitchell to pay, was helping him build the wall that would shut me out of my own life. I didn't scream, I didn't cry. I carefully set the paper back into the folder, closed the manila cover, and aligned it exactly where it had been on the desk. I stood up, walked out of the office, and closed the door behind me, the brass latch clicking into place with a sound that felt as final as a spade of dirt hitting a casket. Curtis's boots were muddy. He didn't take them off at the door, even though the mat I had laid out was specifically for wet autumn shoes. He walked straight into the kitchen, his heavy athletic frame filling the space between the island and the refrigerator. Mitchell followed him, still wearing his wrinkled blue Oxford shirt under a cashmere vest. "Mom," Curtis said, his voice loud, carrying that forced heartiness he used when he was trying to manage a situation. "Dad said you were staying in today. I brought you some of those lemon tarts from the club bakery. You used to love those." He set a white cardboard box on the counter. It had a gold foil seal from the country club. I looked at it, then up at my son. "Thank you, Curtis," I said. He looked around the kitchen, his eyes lingering on the sink, where a single plate and my sardine tin sat unwashed. "You okay? You look a little pale." "Dad said you've been having some trouble with your hip again." "My hip is fine," I said, leaning against the counter, my hands clasped in front of my apron. "How was your lunch?" "Good, really good," Curtis said, though he wouldn't meet my eyes. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, checking it quickly before putting it back. "We were just talking about the retirement transition. There's a lot of loose ends to tie up with the firm. It's a big adjustment for Dad." "I'm sure it is," I said. "And for you too as the executor." Curtis froze. His hand, which had been reaching for the refrigerator handle to look for a soda, stopped midair. He turned to look at me, his face going slightly stiff before he forced a quick, dismissive smile. "Well, yeah, just the standard legal stuff, Mom. You know how Dad is. He likes everything in its proper place." "Yes," I said, looking at the small gold watch on his wrist. The one Mitchell had given him when he passed the bar exam, the one that had belonged to my father. "He likes his boxes. And he likes you helping him build them." Mitchell, who had been standing by the hallway door sipping a glass of water, set the glass down with a sharp click. "Curtis, we should get going if we're going to look at that lumber for your deck before the yard closes." "Right." "Yeah," Curtis said, looking relieved. He took 2 steps back toward the door. "We'll talk later, Mom. Call Brenda if you need anything, okay? She's just at home with the kids." "I'll do that," I said. I watched them walk out. Curtis didn't look back. He had the same hurried, defensive stride he'd had when he was 15, and had broken the basement window with a baseball, spending 3 days pretending he didn't know how the glass got there. The hardest part of a betrayal is not the husband who strikes you. It is the child you raised, the one whose forehead you kissed when they had nightmares, who now holds the coat of the person doing it. Curtis wasn't a victim of his father's manipulation. He was an active partner. He had looked at the draft of that separation agreement. the one that would leave his mother with a drafty house and 5 years of meager support. And he had written, "Dad, looks good." As soon as the sound of the Lexus died away, I went to the wall phone in the kitchen. I didn't use my cell phone. Mitchell paid the bill for that, and I knew he could look at the call logs if he decided to check. The landline was different. It was bundled with the local utility, and the bill came in a paper envelope once a month. I dialed Curtis's home number. Brenda answered on the second ring. In the background, I could hear the television playing a cartoon and the high, sharp laugh of my granddaughter, Lily. "Brenda," I said, "it's Lorraine." "Oh, Lorraine," Brenda said. Her voice was guarded, still stiff from the weekend's conflict. "Is everything okay?" Curtis said he was going to drop by the house with his dad. "Everything is fine," I said, keeping my voice soft, warm, and entirely normal. I just wanted to call and apologize again about the weekend. I know how much you and Curtis needed that break. "Well, it's fine," Brenda said, though she sounded tired. "We're just hanging out. Curtis is out with his dad now." "Yes, they just left here," I said. "They were talking about the lumber for the deck. And then they were going to look at some listings. I wanted to tell you how beautiful I think that townhouse in Savannah is." There was a long, heavy silence on the line. "Savannah?" Brenda asked, her voice dropping its defensive edge, replaced by a sudden, sharp confusion. "What townhouse in Savannah?" "Oh," I said, letting a small touch of surprise creep into my tone. "The retirement property Mitchell is buying. The one near the river. Curtis was telling me about it. I assumed he had shown you the photos. He said you were both going to look at the listings this weekend." "Curtis hasn't said a word to me about Savannah," Brenda said. I could hear her shifting the phone to her other ear, the cartoon in the background suddenly sounding very loud in the quiet kitchen. "Why would Mitchell be buying a townhouse in Georgia? He's retiring here." "Well, I'm sure Curtis just forgot to mention it," I said, my voice dripping with the gentle, maternal reassurance that Mitchell had always used to dismiss me. "You know how men are when they start doing estate planning. They get so focused on the legal details, they forget to share the details with the family. Don't worry about it, dear. I'm sure he'll show you tonight." "He's the executor," Brenda muttered, more to herself than to me. "He's not supposed to be making real estate decisions for his father without. Lorraine, does Mitchell have that kind of liquid cash?" "I don't know, Brenda," I said softly. "Mitchell handles all the accounts. I just wash the shirts." "I need to go," Brenda said, her voice tight, the anger rising in her throat. "The kids are. I need to go. Of course, dear, give my love to Lily." I hung up the phone. I stood by the wall, my hand still resting on the yellow plastic receiver. Mitchell and Curtis had built their little fortress of secrets, confident that the women in their lives would remain in their designated places, cooking the meals, tending the children, and asking no questions. They believed Brenda was too busy with diaper changes and grocery lists to notice the financial movements, just as they believed I was too broken and compliant to look in a folder. But a secret is like a crack in a dam. Once you let a little water through, the pressure of the rest does the work for you. I walked over to the kitchen window and looked out at the backyard. The sun was setting, casting long purple shadows across the grass. The air was getting colder. I had no car keys, I had no passport. I had $4,000 in a blue leather book. But as I watched the first frost begin to sparkle on the edges of the maple leaves, I knew that the fire had already been lit inside the fortress. I just had to sit in my quiet house and watch it burn. Saturday night was louder than usual, even though no one was shouting. I was lying in the guest room bed, the floral sheets smelling of lavender starch, when the telephone rang downstairs. It was 10:30. In our house, a call that late was always an emergency, a broken water pipe, a sick grandchild, or a client in crisis. I heard Mitchell's heavy footsteps in the hallway. He answered on the second ring. For a few minutes, there was only the low, muffled rumble of his voice. Then his tone shifted. It became sharp, defensive, and hurried. "What do you mean?" She threw a plate. Mitchell hissed. I could hear him clearly through the floorboards. He was standing right under my room, near the cold air return. "Curtis, calm down. Brenda is overreacting. There's no Savannah property in your name." "Yes, I know your name is on the trust, but that's estate planning." "No, she doesn't know about the separation draft." "How could she?" There was a long pause. I sat up in bed, my hands pulling the quilt to my chin. "She told her what?" Mitchell's voice cracked slightly, a sound of genuine panic that I had never heard from him in 34 years. "How did she find out?" "No, I didn't leave the folder out." "Fine, I'll handle it. Just tell Brenda it's a tax shelter for the retirement. Tell her anything. I'll call you tomorrow." He hung up the phone. The silence that followed was heavy, like the air before a summer thunderstorm. I heard his footsteps coming up the stairs. They didn't have their usual slow, arrogant rhythm. They were fast, heavy, and loud. My door opened without a knock. The hallway light was behind him, casting his long, dark shadow across the floral sheets of my bed. His face was in shadow, but I could see the rapid rise and fall of his chest. "You went into my office," he said. His voice was very quiet, but it vibrated with a rage that had no outlet. "You left the door open, Mitchell," I said, my voice steady in the dark. "Those are confidential business documents, Lorraine. You had no right to look at them. And then you called Brenda? You're trying to destroy your own son's family. Curtis is in an absolute mess right now because you decided to spread lies." "They aren't lies, Mitchell," I said, leaning back against the wooden headboard. "There is a townhouse in Savannah. You are listed as an unmarried man. And Curtis wrote a note telling you it looked good. He knew you were planning to leave me with 5 years of grocery money while you took everything we built together." Mitchell took a step into the room. He looked smaller in the dim light of the hallway, his shoulders rounded, his hair messy from where he had been running his fingers through it. "It's a draft, Lorraine. It's a preliminary proposal. Robert Harris recommended we set up a dual residency structure for the tax advantages after retirement. You don't understand how these things work. You've never had to worry about tax brackets or corporate restructuring." "I understand what unmarried man means, Mitchell," I said, "and I understand that my son helped you hide it. If you think you can fight me on this, you're losing your mind," Mitchell said, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous growl. "Robert Harris is the best family lawyer in the state. If you try to drag this into court, I'll make sure you don't even get the house on Cedar Lane. I'll tie up the assets in probate for 10 years. You'll be 80 before you see a single dollar. And you'll spend your father's little $4,000 on a retainer in the first month. You have nothing. I have my name, Mitchell, I said, and I have my silence. And right now, you're the one who is terrified of what I'm going to do with both. He stared at me, his mouth opening slightly as if to speak, but no words came out. For 30 years, his threats had been the final word in our house. He had used his money, his profession, and his status to keep me quiet, believing that a woman with no career and no savings would always choose safety over dignity. He turned and walked out, slamming the door so hard the framed print of the Pennsylvania hills on the wall shifted on its wire. On Sunday morning, Mitchell was gone. He had left before dawn, likely to drive to Curtis's house to help his son manage Brenda. The garage was empty. The house was quiet. The only sound the steady metallic drip of the failing water heater in the basement. I walked down the long driveway to the mailbox. The morning air was crisp, the grass covered in a thick layer of white frost that crunched under my slippers. Teresa's blue sedan pulled up to the curb. Teresa was 60. Her husband, a local dentist who had been partners with Dr. Vance, had left her 5 years ago for a hygienist 20 years younger. She had gone through a 2-year court battle that had set the local gossip lines on fire. She had lost her house, but she had kept her pension share and her dignity. I opened the passenger door and got in. The car was warm, smelling of vanilla air freshener and old coffee. Teresa looked at me. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't offer any empty platitudes. She just looked at my faded cardigan, my graying hair, and the quiet, steady set of my jaw. "You look like you haven't slept in a week, Lorraine," she said, shifting the car into drive. "I slept," I said. "For the first time in 30 years, actually." "Mitchell's car is gone," she noted, watching the road as we drove past the neat brick houses of our subdivision. "I saw him fly out of the driveway at 6 this morning. He looked like he was on his way to a fire." "He was," I said. Teresa let out a short, dry laugh. "When my David started moving the money, I thought I was crazy. I thought I was misplacing the statements. I even went to a doctor because David told me I was becoming forgetful. He had the doctor write a prescription for anxiety. Mitchell told me I was lucky he was still here," I said, looking out the window at the brown cornfields passing by. "He said no one else would choose me." Teresa slowed down for a stop sign. She turned to look at me, her eyes sharp and steady behind her tortoise-shell glasses. "A man like Mitchell doesn't want you to leave, Lorraine. He wants you to stay exactly where you are, feeling so small that you'll thank him for the crumbs he drops from his table. Because if you stay small, he gets to feel like a king." "He's not a king," I said. "No," Teresa said, turning onto the highway toward the city. "He's just an old man with a checkbook. And today, we're going to see a woman who knows exactly how to balance it." Marianne Giles's office did not look like the office of a woman who handled the messy, broken ends of suburban marriages. It was located on the second floor of a converted red brick Victorian house in the older part of the city, where the streets were still paved with Belgian block. The room smelled of lavender water, beeswax polish, and the dry, comforting scent of old legal volumes. There were no sleek glass desks or silver frames. Instead, there was a faded Persian rug, a cast iron radiator that hissed and clanked in the corner, and a large oak desk covered in neat stacks of cream-colored folders. Marianne herself was a woman in her late 60s, with iron gray hair cut into a sharp bob and eyes that looked like they had seen every variation of human greed and disappointment. She didn't look at me with pity. When Teresa introduced us, Marianne simply shook my hand, her grip dry and firm, and pointed to a green leather wingback chair. "Teresa tells me your husband is Mitchell Miller," Marianne said, leaning back in her chair and folding her hands over her wool skirt. "Miller and Vance. He's the senior partner for the estate and corporate division." "Yes," I said. "He has a reputation for being very precise," Marianne noted, her eyes scanning my face, taking in my faded sweater, the stiff way I held my hands in my lap, the quiet shadow of exhaustion around my eyes. "A man who doesn't like loose ends. Tell me what happened, Lorraine." I spent 40 minutes speaking. I didn't cry. I told her about the closed joint account, the $800 dental bill, the canceled insurance, the missing passport, and the manila folder on Mitchell's desk. I told her about Curtis's note, "Dad looks good." When I finished, the radiator in the corner let out a long, wheezing sigh. Marianne Giles didn't move for a long moment. She sat in the quiet room, her fingers tapping a slow, silent rhythm against her chin. "He committed a major tactical error," Marianne said, her voice quiet and cold. "By listing himself as an unmarried man on a real estate purchase agreement in Georgia while still legally married in the state of Pennsylvania. Mitchell has committed a form of misrepresentation that borders on mortgage fraud, depending on how the financing is structured. More importantly, he has handed us a lever." "A lever?" I asked. "Your husband's firm is currently preparing for his retirement transition," Marianne explained, leaning forward. "During a transition, the senior partner's personal finances are subject to intense scrutiny by the remaining partners and the insurers. The last thing Miller and Vance wants is a public scandal involving a senior partner hiding assets, manipulating estate trusts, and falsifying his marital status on legal documents. It would destroy the firm's credibility." She opened a drawer and pulled out a clean sheet of yellow legal pad. "We aren't going to file for divorce yet, Lorraine. If we file today, Mitchell will go to ground, and Robert Harris will find a way to tie up the liquid cash in corporate shells. First, we file a petition for emergency spousal support and an injunction to freeze the Savannah property transfer. We do it quietly, but we deliver the copies directly to his partners at the firm." She looked at me over her reading glasses. "It will cost $3,000 to start. For the filing fees and the forensic accountant, I'll need to trace the $84,000 he moved from your joint account." I reached into my purse, pulled out the blue leather passbook, and set it on the oak desk. "There is $4,000 in here. It's my father's money. It's all I have." Marianne Giles looked at the faded blue book. She didn't touch it immediately. She looked at me, her eyes softening just a fraction of an inch. "Your father would be very glad you kept it, Lorraine," she said softly. She took the book and slid it into a drawer. "I'll have the papers drafted by tomorrow afternoon. Teresa will bring you back to sign them. In the meantime, you go home. You do not tell Mitchell you saw me. You do not tell your children. You cook his dinner. You wash his dishes. And you let him believe you are still the ghost he thinks he bought. Teresa dropped me off at the end of the driveway at 4 o'clock. The sun was already slipping below the horizon, leaving a thin, bloody ribbon of orange light across the gray Pennsylvania sky. When I walked through the back door, the kitchen was warm, but the light was off. My daughter, Sylvia, was sitting at the kitchen table. She was wearing her black wool office coat, her briefcase sitting on the chair next to her. Mitchell was standing behind her, his arms crossed over his chest, his face dark and still in the twilight. Sylvia didn't look up when the door clicked shut. She was staring at a cold mug of tea I had left on the table this morning. "Mom," she said. Her voice was flat, empty of the busy, impatient energy she usually carried. "Where have you been?" "I was out with Teresa," I said, setting my purse on the counter. "Curtis called me," Sylvia said, finally looking up. Her eyes were red, her face tight with a bitter, defensive anger. "He said Brenda is packing her bags to go to her mother's in Ohio. She thinks Curtis is helping Dad hide money from her. She thinks they're buying property in Georgia behind her back. Curtis is completely broken, Mom. He's sitting in his living room crying because his wife won't speak to him. Curtis should have thought about his wife before he helped his father write a separation agreement that leaves his mother with nothing," I said, my voice very quiet, very cold. Sylvia stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the linoleum. "Dad explained that to me, Mom. It's a trust. It's for the family. You don't understand how these things work. You've always been so unstable about money. Just like Grandma was before she had to be put in the home. You start getting these paranoid ideas, and now you're destroying Curtis's marriage because of them." "Your grandmother wasn't paranoid, Sylvia," I said, stepping closer to the table. "She was lonely, and she was tired of being told she was crazy by a man who didn't want to look at her anymore." Mitchell stepped forward, his hand resting heavily on Sylvia's shoulder. "That's enough, Lorraine. You are behaving like a sick woman. Sylvia and I have been talking. We think it's time you saw Dr. Fletcher. He's the specialist who handled your mother's transition. We can schedule an evaluation for Tuesday morning." He looked at me with a cold, triumphant smile. He believed he had found the perfect solution. If he could paint me as mentally incompetent, if he could get a doctor to sign a paper saying I was suffering from the same cognitive decline that had taken my mother, my claims about the bank accounts, the townhouse, and the separation agreement would become nothing more than the delusions of an aging, sick woman. Sylvia looked at me, her face pale, but her jaw was set. She was willing to believe him. She was willing to sacrifice her own mother's sanity, to protect the comfortable structure of her family, to protect the father who paid her credit card bills and helped her buy her condo. "An evaluation," I said, my voice barely a whisper in the dark kitchen. "It's for your own good, Mom," Sylvia said, her voice shaking slightly, but she didn't look away. "We just want you to get some help. Before you do any more damage." I looked at my daughter. I saw the girl I had stayed up with for 3 days when she had scarlet fever, the girl whose wedding dress I had altered by hand, because she didn't trust the seamstress. A daughter's cruelty is often sharper than a husband's, because she uses the very vulnerabilities you handed her while trying to keep her safe. All right, I said, looking at Mitchell. Tuesday morning. I'll be ready. Mitchell's smile widened just a fraction of an inch. He thought he had won. He thought the ghost was going back into her box. But as I turned to walk up the stairs, my hand resting lightly on the banister, I knew that Tuesday morning was 3 days away, and Marianne Giles only needed one. On Monday morning, Mitchell ate 3 eggs. I stood by the stove, my back to him, watching the butter bubble and foam in the cast-iron skillet. I cooked them exactly the way he liked. Whites firm, yolks runny, with a pinch of white pepper instead of black, so there wouldn't be any dark specks on the yellow. He was sitting at the kitchen island, reading the financial section of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. He had his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose, his gray hair brushed back, looking every inch the dignified senior partner. He was pleasant. It was the pleasantness of a jailer who has finally locked the cell door and can now afford to be kind to the prisoner. Fletcher is a good man, Lorraine, he said, folding the newspaper and setting it next to his coffee mug. He's very gentle. He handled your mother's transition with a lot of dignity. He'll just ask you some simple questions, memory exercises. It's nothing to be nervous about. I'm not nervous, Mitchell, I said, sliding the eggs onto his plate. Good. He picked up his fork and cut into a yolk, the yellow liquid spilling across the white ceramic. Sylvia will be here at 9 tomorrow to drive you. I have a meeting with the executive committee at 10, so I won't be able to go with you. But Sylvia knows the way. Just wear something neat. Don't wear that gray cardigan. It makes you look washed out. I'll wear the blue dress, I said. He looked up, a brief flicker of surprise in his eyes at my compliance. But it was quickly placed by that comfortable, heavy arrogance he had worn for 30 years. The blue one is nice. It has some color. He finished his breakfast in 10 minutes. I wiped down the counter while he gathered his leather briefcase and his wool overcoat. He didn't kiss my cheek. He stopped by the back door, his hand on the brass knob, and looked back at me standing by the sink with the yellow sponge in my hand. We're doing the right thing, Lorraine, he said. You'll see. Once we get the diagnosis, we can get some real help, some peace of mind. Yes, I said, peace of mind. The screen door clicked shut. I stood by the window and watched his Lexus back out of the driveway, its tires crunching on the dry maple leaves. Teresa was waiting for me at the end of the Cedar Lane cul-de-sac at 1 o'clock. We didn't speak during the drive into the city. The sky was the color of a wet slate shingle, and the wind was coming off the river in cold, greasy gusts that rattled the windshield wipers. In Marianne Giles's office, the oak desk was covered in thick white packets of paper. The top page of each packet bore a heavy blue ink stamp. Filed Family Division, Court of Common Pleas. Marianne Giles was standing by the window, a cup of tea in her hand. She turned when we entered and pointed to the desk. We filed the emergency petitions at 10 this morning, Lorraine, she said, her voice calm and clinical. We have filed for emergency spousal maintenance, an injunction to freeze all transfers of marital assets, and a petition to compel the disclosure of all sole owner accounts. By 1:30, a private process server delivered the copies directly to Donald Vance, the managing partner of Mitchell's firm. My hand reached out, my fingers touching the cold, stiff paper of the filing. My name was at the top, Lorraine M. Miller, petitioner. Underneath it, Mitchell T. Miller, respondent. But we found something else, Marianne said, setting her tea down and picking up a thin folder from her desk. My forensic accountant spent yesterday evening looking at the public filing registries for Mitchell's partnership draws. He didn't just move the $84,000 from your joint savings, Lorraine. I looked at her. What did he do? Over the last 6 months, Mitchell has taken out 3 private signature loans against his partnership equity in the firm, Marianne said, her eyes fixed on mine. Nearly $300,000. And every dollar of that money was wired directly to a commercial developer in Savannah, Georgia. The air in the room felt very thin. He bought the townhouse. He put a down payment on it, yes. But he also signed a personal guarantee using your marital home on Cedar Lane as secondary collateral for the construction loan, Marianne explained, her finger tracing a line on a financial printout. He was setting up a structure where, if he separated from you, the debt of his new life in Savannah would remain attached to your joint liabilities. If he defaulted or if you tried to claim a share of his pension, the bank would have the right to foreclose on your house. He wasn't just leaving you, Lorraine. He was planning to bankrupt you to pay for his retirement. A woman doesn't stop loving her family all at once. She does it in small, quiet pieces, until one day there is nothing left but the habit of care. But looking at that yellow paper, looking at the numbers Mitchell had written in his neat, precise hand, I realized that the man I had shared a bed with for 34 years had spent the last 6 months calculating how to ruin me. He had looked at my gray hair, my stiff hip, and my quiet life, and he had decided that my survival was a cost he didn't want to pay. "Where do I sign?" I asked. Marianne Giles handed me a heavy gold pen. I signed my name 6 times. The ink was black, thick, and permanent. Teresa dropped me off at 4:30. The house was dark. I didn't turn on the kitchen lights. I sat at the table in the gray twilight, my hands wrapped around a mug of hot water to stop the shaking. At 5 o'clock, the kitchen phone rang. I didn't answer it. I sat there, listening to the high, sharp bell ring 10 times before it stopped. 2 minutes later, it started again. On the 14th ring of the 3rd call, I stood up and picked up the receiver. "Mom," it was Curtis. His voice wasn't loud or angry. It was thin, breathless, and shaking with a terror that made him sound like the 10-year-old boy who had gotten lost in the woods behind our house. "Mom, is Dad there?" "No, Curtis," I said. "He's not home yet." "Mom, Donald Vance just called me," Curtis stammered, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. "The firm, they just suspended Dad. They locked his email. They told him he can't come into the office. There are sheriff's deputies at the firm serving subpoenas for the partnership accounts." "Mom, what did you do? What did you file?" I looked out the kitchen window. The first street lights were coming on along Cedar Lane, their yellow lights sparkling on the frost-covered grass. "I didn't do anything, Curtis," I said, my voice very quiet, very steady. "I just asked for my share." "Mom, you're ruining everything," he cried, his voice cracking into a sob. "The trust. My name is on those accounts. The bank just froze my personal line because of the association with the trust. Brenda won't even talk to me. You're destroying the family. The family was destroyed 6 months ago, Curtis, I said. Your father and you just forgot to tell me. Before he could answer, I heard the sound of tires roaring up the gravel driveway. The headlights of Mitchell's Lexus swept across the kitchen wall, bright, cold, and blinding. The kitchen door didn't slam. It opened slowly, the cold draft of the autumn night rushing ahead of Mitchell like a physical presence. He walked in, his wool overcoat unbuttoned, his silk tie crooked. He didn't have his briefcase. His hands were empty, his fingers curled into loose, trembling fists. He stood in the dim light of the microwave clock, looking at me sitting at the kitchen table. He looked old. The sharp executive posture he had maintained for decades had collapsed. His shoulders slumped, his chest hollowed under his vest. "Lorraine," he said. His voice was a thin, dry whisper, stripped of all its baritone authority. "What did you do?" "I filed the paperwork, Mitchell," I said. "Marianne Giles is my attorney. She's very thorough." He took 3 slow steps toward the table, his leather shoes clicking softly on the linoleum. Donald Vance called me into his office at 2 o'clock. Robert Harris was there. There were deputies, Lorraine, in the lobby of my firm. They served the partnership with an injunction. They froze the escrow account for the Savannah transfer. "I know," I said. He leaned his hands on the back of the chair across from me, his knuckles turning white. They locked me out of the database. They escorted me to the elevator. 34 years, Lorraine. I built that firm. I put Donald Vance's name on the glass. And today they treated me like a thief in front of the junior associates. You signed a mortgage declaration in Georgia stating you were an unmarried man, Mitchell, I said, looking at his pale face. And you used our home, the home we bought with my father's help, as collateral for a private loan to build it. You were going to leave me with the debt of your new life. That makes you a thief." Mitchell looked down at his hands, the anger I had expected, the shouting, the broken plates, the heavy, suffocating rage didn't come. Instead, a terrifying, desperate stillness settled over him. "We can fix this," he whispered, sitting down in the chair. He reached across the table, his hand stopping just short of mine, his fingers twitching. "I'll cancel the Savannah contract. I'll put the $84,000 back in the savings account. I'll sign the Cedar Lane house over to you entirely. Just call this Giles woman. Tell her it was a misunderstanding. Tell her you were confused about the accounts." I looked at him. I saw the small, pathetic calculations still turning in his eyes. He didn't regret what he had done to me. He only regretted that he had been caught. He was still trying to use the confused wife narrative to save his reputation. "You want me to tell them I'm mentally incompetent," I said. "The way you wanted, Dr. Fletcher to say tomorrow morning." Mitchell went entirely pale. He pulled his hands back, his mouth twisting into a hard, desperate line. "It was the only way to protect the assets, Lorraine. You don't understand how high-level finance works. If the firm is audited, if there's a liability suit, the trust protects us. I was doing it for both of us." "Your name is on the Savannah townhouse, Mitchell. Curtis's name is on the trust. My name is only on the debt," I said. "You were doing it for yourself." Before he could answer, the headlights of another car swept across the kitchen window. The high, sharp whine of a small engine filled the driveway, followed by the sound of car doors slamming and hurried, stumbling footsteps on the back porch. The door burst open. Sylvia stood in the doorway, her hair wild from the wind, her mascara smeared under her eyes. She was holding her phone in her hand like a weapon. Behind her, Curtis stepped into the kitchen. He looked like he had been running. His shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, his face red and wet with tears. "Mom," Sylvia gasped, stepping into the room. "Dad, Curtis's firm just called him. They're launching an ethical review of his engineering license." I stood up from the table. "An ethical review." "Because of the trust!" Curtis cried, his voice breaking into a high, hysterical sob. He walked over to the counter, leaning his head against the wooden cabinets. "I signed the trust documents as a notary, Mom. Since I'm a licensed professional engineer, the state board has strict rules about notarizing documents with fraudulent marital declarations. Donald Vance's lawyer called my company's legal department. They're suspending me pending an investigation. I could lose my license. My career is over, Mom. Everything I worked for." Sylvia turned on me, her eyes wild with a bitter defensive fury. "Do you see what you've done? You wanted to get back at Dad, and now you've ruined Curtis's life. He has 2 kids, Mom. He has a mortgage. How is he supposed to pay for his house if he can't work?" I looked at my son, sobbing against the kitchen counter. Then I looked at my daughter, her face distorted with blame. Finally, I looked at Mitchell. He was sitting in his chair, his eyes fixed on the table, his face entirely blank. He had known. When he asked Curtis to notary those documents, when he asked his son to sign his name to the lie, Mitchell had known the risk to Curtis's license. But he had used him anyway. He had used his own son's professional credentials as a shield for his fraud, confident that his wife would never have the courage to expose them. "I didn't notarize those documents, Curtis," I said, my voice very quiet, very cold. "Your father asked you to lie for him, and you chose to do it because you thought there was $42,000 in it for you." Curtis looked up, his face pale, his eyes wide with a sudden, sickening realization. He looked at his father, but Mitchell wouldn't meet his eyes. "Mom, please," Sylvia whispered, her voice shifting from anger to a desperate, childlike pleading. "You have to withdraw the filing. For Curtis, for the kids. You can't let him lose his license. Please, Mom, just call the lawyer." I stood in the middle of my kitchen, the 3 of them looking at me. My husband, my son, and my daughter. For 30 years they had built their lives on the assumption that my love was a permanent resource, something they could mine, exhaust, and discard without ever having to pay for it. And now they were asking me to use that same love to save them from the consequences of their own cruelty. I reached into my pocket and felt the cold, hard edge of the brass key to the guest room door. "Dad?" Curtis' voice was barely a whisper. He was staring at Mitchell, his eyes wide and wet, his chest heaving under his flannel shirt. He had stopped crying, replaced by a sudden cold panic that made him look small and fragile in the dim light of our kitchen. "Say something, Dad. Tell Mom you told me it was legal." "Tell her you," says Robert Harris cleared the notary on the trust. Mitchell didn't look up. He was still staring at the white laminate of the kitchen island, his fingers tracing a tiny invisible circle near his empty water glass. Mitchell, I said, my voice very quiet. Tell your son the truth. Mitchell cleared his throat, a dry, rasping sound. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat, carrying the cold professional distance of a senior partner, delivering a brief to an associate who had failed a case. Curtis is an adult. He's a licensed professional. He has a duty under state law to verify any document before he applies his seal. I can't testify to what he did or didn't read. The room went entirely cold. Curtis took a step back, his hand falling from the counter. He looked at his father as if he were a stranger who had just stepped out of the dark. You told me it was a formality, Dad. You said it was just a dual residency structure. You said if I notarized the signature, you'd help us with the down payment on the lake cabin next summer. I said we would discuss it, Mitchell said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. But you signed the document, Curtis. You're the notary of record. If you didn't read the marital status declaration, that's a professional omission on your part. I can't protect you from the licensing board. He was protecting himself. If Mitchell admitted that he had instructed Curtis to notarize a fraudulent document, he would be admitting to conspiracy to commit mortgage fraud, a federal offense. By throwing his own son to the state licensing board, by claiming Curtis had acted independently and carelessly, Mitchell was keeping his own name clear of the criminal charge. Sylvia let out a sharp, horrified breath. She looked at her father, then at her brother, her face pale and empty of the bitter anger she had brought into the room. Dad, you used him. I didn't use anyone, Mitchell said, standing up from his chair. He looked at me, his eyes cold and empty. Your mother is the one who filed the public injunction. She's the one who went to Donald Vance. If Curtis loses his license, it's because she chose to drag our family business into the court system. No, Mitchell, I said, standing by the stove. If Curtis loses his license, it's because he chose to help you steal from his mother. And now he has to learn what your loyalty is actually worth. Curtis didn't speak. He turned and walked out of the kitchen, his heavy boots dragging on the floorboards. The screen door clicked open, then shut, and a moment later the sound of his car engine roared in the driveway, fading quickly into the quiet suburban night. Sylvia looked at me, her eyes filled with a sudden, desperate terror. She didn't look at her father. Mom, what are we going to do? You should go home, Sylvius, I said. It's late, and you have to work tomorrow. But the evaluation, she whispered. The appointment with Dr. Fletcher is at 9. I won't be there, Sylvia, I said, my voice very quiet, very firm. I have other appointments. On Tuesday morning, the frost on the grass was thicker than before, sparkling like crushed glass under the yellow streetlights. I was dressed by 7. I didn't wear the blue dress Mitchell had chosen. I wore my old gray wool trousers and my mother's camel coat, the one that smelled of lavender and old closets. I left a small, handwritten note on the kitchen counter next to Mitchell's empty coffee pot. I'm going out. Teresa was waiting for me at the corner of Cedar Lane. We drove 40 minutes north, past the industrial parks and the gray, empty cornfields, until we reached the subdivision where Curtis and Brenda lived. Their house was a modern, 2-story colonial with a neat, manicured lawn that looked exactly like every other house on the street. When Brenda opened the door, She was wearing a faded sweatshirt, her hair pulled back in a messy bun. Behind her, the living room was filled with cardboard moving boxes, some half filled with children's toys, others taped shut and stacked by the front window. She looked at me, her eyes red-rimmed and tired, her mouth turning into a hard, defensive line. "Lorraine, what are you doing here?" "I came to see you, Brenda," I said, stepping into the warm, quiet hallway. "Not Curtis, just you." Brenda hesitated, then let out a long, heavy sigh and stepped back to let me in. The house smelled of packing tape, cold coffee, and the stale, quiet grief of a marriage that was falling apart in silence. We sat at her kitchen table, which was covered in packing paper and bubble wrap. In the next room, I could hear the quiet murmur of the television playing a morning news show. "Curtis is in the bedroom," Brenda said, her fingers tracing a seam on her sweatshirt. "He hasn't slept. He's just sitting there looking at the ceiling. His company put him on administrative leave this morning. They're locking his office." "I know," I said. "He lied to me, Lorraine," she said, her voice cracking into a sudden, quiet sob. "He told me the trust was just a standard estate thing for Mitchell's retirement. He didn't tell me he was notarizing documents that said Mitchell was unmarried. He didn't tell me he was using your home as collateral. Now we're going to lose this house. I have 2 kids, Lorraine. How am I supposed to pay for their school? How are we supposed to live?" I reached into my purse and pulled out a clean white envelope. Inside was a document that Marianne Giles had drafted yesterday evening, after Curtis had called me in a panic. I set the envelope on the packing paper between us. "What is that?" Brenda asked, looking at the white paper. "It's an affidavit of cooperation, Brenda," I said, keeping my voice very steady. "If Curtis signs it, and if he turns over every email, every text message, and every document he exchanged with Mitchell regarding the trust and the Savannah townhouse to Marianne Giles, we will present it to the state licensing board." Brenda looked at the envelope, her hand trembling. "And what does that do?" "It proves that Curtis was acting under the undue influence and manipulation of his father, who was his employer and a senior legal partner," I explained. "It proves he didn't initiate the fraud. The board will likely suspend his license for 6 months for the notary omission, but they won't revoke it. He'll keep his credentials. He'll keep his career." Brenda's eyes filled with a sudden, desperate hope. She reached out and touched the envelope, her fingers tracing the sharp white edge. "And what happens to Mitchell?" "The affidavit will be filed with the Court of Common Pleas," I said softly. "It will become a matter of public record. It will prove Mitchell's intentional fraud, and the Georgia Bank will immediately accelerate the foreclosure on his Savannah townhouse. Miller and Vance will have to liquidate his partnership share to pay the damages. It will destroy him, Brenda, professionally, financially, and legally." "He deserves it," Brenda whispered, her jaw tightening. "He tried to ruin you, and he didn't care if he ruined his own son to do it." "Yes," I said, "but Curtis has to sign it. He has to testify against his own father in a court of law. He has to choose between Mitchell's approval and his own family's survival." Before Brenda could answer, we heard a quiet creak in the hallway. Curtis was standing in the doorway of the kitchen. He had shaved, but his face looked hollow, his eyes sunken and gray. He was looking at the white envelope sitting on the table, his hand leaning heavily against the door frame for support. Curtis walked to the kitchen table, his steps slow and heavy, as if the air in his own house had turned to wet sand. He didn't look at Brenda. He didn't look at me. He kept his eyes fixed on the white envelope sitting on the packing paper. "If I sign this," he said, his voice flat and dry, "what happens to Dad? He'll face a civil suit for asset dissipation and fraud," I said softly. "The firm will likely force him to surrender his partnership equity to cover the loans. The Georgia bank will foreclose on the Savannah property." "And prison?" Curtis asked, looking up. His eyes were bloodshot, the skin under his eyes dark and hollow. "Will they put him in prison?" "That is up to the district attorney in Georgia," I said. "But if you don't sign it, Curtis, you are his co-conspirator. The state licensing board will view your notary stamp as an intentional act of fraud. You will lose your license, your career, and quite possibly your freedom." "He's my father, Mom," Curtis whispered, his hands trembling as he reached for the edge of the table. "Everything I have, the school I went to, the job I got, the car I drive, he paid for it. He built my life." Brenda stood up, her chair legs barking against the linoleum. "He didn't build your life, Curtis. He bought your compliance. And the second his own name was threatened, he threw you to the wolves. Did you hear him last night? He sat in that kitchen and told your mother that you were an adult who should have read the documents. He didn't care if you went to jail, as long as he kept his Savannah townhouse." Curtis looked down, his shoulders shaking. A single tear fell, spotting the gray packing paper on the table. He was 32 years old, a father of two. But looking at him then, I saw the 9-year-old boy who had spent 3 hours standing in the rain because his father had told him that only quitters came inside before the yard work was done. For some children, the search for a father's approval is a lifelong hunger that they will gladly starve their own families to feed, until they realize the plate was always empty. "Sign it, Curtis," Brenda said, her voice dropping into a low, fierce whisper. She reached over and slid the black ballpoint pen across the table. "For Lily, for Leo. Put your own children first, the way your father never did." Curtis stood there for 5 long seconds. Then he sat down in the chair across from me. He pulled the white affidavit from the envelope, his fingers fumbling with the stapled edges. He didn't read it again. He knew what was in it. He knew he was signing the document that would dismantle his father's life. He pressed the pen to the paper. His hand shook so hard the tip of the pen scratched against the wood. But he signed. He signed his name on the line, then turned the page and signed again. When he finished, he slid the paper back into the envelope, pushed it toward me, and buried his face in his hands, his shoulders heaving in silent, violent sobs. Brenda walked over and put her hand on his back, her eyes meeting mine over his shaking shoulders. There was no triumph in her face, only the heavy, grim relief of a woman who had just cut the anchor to save the ship. Teresa dropped me off at Cedar Lane at 3 o'clock. The Lexus was in the driveway. The garage door was open, and the house looked quiet, the windows dark under the gray afternoon sky. When I walked through the kitchen door, the house smelled of cardboard and old dust. Mitchell was in the living room. He had a large wardrobe box, sitting on the Persian rug, and he was packing his things. His leather-bound history books, his silver golf trophies from the club, his crystal decanters from the sideboard. He didn't look up when I entered. He was wrapping a crystal tumbler in newspaper, his fingers taping the edges with a rapid, aggressive rhythm. "Sylvia called," he said, his voice flat and dry. "She waited at Fletcher's office for 45 minutes. She said you didn't show." "I was with Curtis," I said, setting my purse on the counter. Mitchell let out a short, mocking laugh, not looking at me. "Trying to play the comforting mother? You're the one who ruined him, Lorraine. I hope you're happy. The boy is suspended. His career is in ruins, and Brenda is leaving him. All because you decided to play the martyr." "Curtis signed the cooperative affidavit, Mitchell," I said softly, stepping into the living room. Mitchell stopped. His hand froze over the crystal tumbler. The newspaper crinkled in his grip, a sharp, dry sound in the quiet room. He slowly turned his head to look at me, his face turning an ash gray, his eyes narrowing into two dark slits. "He signed what?" "The Giles affidavit," I said. "He's turning over all the texts, the emails, and the trust documents. He's testifying against you to save his license." Mitchell's hands began to shake. The crystal tumbler slipped from his fingers, hitting the cardboard box with a dull thud. He didn't pick it up. He stood there, his chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow gasps, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Then slowly his mouth twisted into a cold, terrifying grin. It was the grin of a man who had just realized he was going down, but who knew exactly how many people he could pull into the grave with him. "You think you've saved him, Lorraine?" Mitchell whispered, stepping closer to me. The smell of stale scotch and old wool was thick on him. "You think you've won?" "I don't think I've won anything, Mitchell," I said. "Donald Vance didn't just suspend me," he hissed, his face inches from mine. "Because of your Giles filing, the firm's executive committee is launching a full forensic audit of the partner escrow pool. They're looking at every transfer over the last 10 years. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping into a low, venomous register. "If they look too deep, Lorraine, they're going to find the transfers from 9 years ago. The ones Curtis used to pay off his gambling debts to those boys in Philadelphia during his senior year of college. The ones I covered using the client escrow account, nearly $40,000. If Vance finds that, Curtis isn't just going to lose his license. He's going to jail for embezzlement. And I'm the only one who has the records to prove I didn't authorize it." He stared at me, his eyes wide and bright with a sickening, triumphant malice. "So you go ahead and file that affidavit, Lorraine. You let your Giles woman put it in the public record. And you watch how fast your precious son's life completely disappears." "That's what a father does, Lorraine," Mitchell said, his voice dropping into a low, self-righteous purr as he wrapped another silver trophy in newsprint. "He manages. Curtis was young. He was stupid. He got in over his head with some very bad people at school, and I solved the problem. I saved him." "No, Mitchell," I said, standing in the doorway, my hands resting flat against my coat pockets. "You didn't save him. You bought a leash, and you've been holding the other end of it for 9 years. Mitchell let out a short, dry snort. He didn't look at me. He taped the box shut, the brown packing tape letting out a loud, tearing screech that echoed in the quiet living room. Call it what you want. But if Donald Vance's auditors find those escrow transfers from '98, your Giles woman won't be able to save him. The state board will be the least of his problems. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to finish packing my clothes. I walked out of the living room. I didn't go up to the guest room. I went straight to the kitchen, picked up the landline receiver, and dialed Mary Ann Giles' office. It was 5 o'clock. The radiator in her office was likely clanking, the smell of beeswax and old paper settling in for the evening. Her receptionist answered on the second ring. And a moment later, Mary Ann's dry, calm voice came through the line. "Lorraine," she said, "did Curtis sign?" "He signs," I said, leaning against the kitchen wall. "But Mitchell just threatened him. He says 9 years ago, Curtis had $40,000 in gambling debts. Mitchell covered them using the firm's client escrow account. He says if the audit goes deep, Curtis will go to jail for embezzlement." The line went very quiet. I could hear the faint, rhythmic sound of Mary Ann's fingers tapping against her desk. "Did Curtis know where the money came from?" she asked. "I don't know," I said, looking out at the gray, freezing twilight of the backyard. He was 23. He was terrified. "Lorraine, listen to me," Mary Ann said, her voice dropping into a low, steady register that felt like a hand holding mine in the dark. "Even if Curtis knew, your husband was the fiduciary. Mitchell was the senior partner who authorized the transfer from the escrow account. It is Mitchell who committed the felony. If Mitchell exposes that transaction to Vance, he is exposing himself to immediate criminal prosecution. It's a murder-suicide bluff. He's trying to terrify you into withdrawing the petition." "But the audit is already happening, Mary Ann," I said. "You said the executive committee is looking at the accounts. If they find it on their own, what happens to Curtis?" "If they find it on their own, it's a problem," Mary Ann admitted, her voice grave. "But we have a window. Donald Vance's forensic team is looking at this year's transactions first to secure the suspension. They won't reach 98 for at least 48 hours. We need to file a voluntary disclosure with the federal prosecutor's office tomorrow morning." "A voluntary disclosure? We present Curtis as a victim of his father's financial coercion," Mary Ann explained. "We show that he was a student under financial duress, and that Mitchell used his position as a parent and a legal partner to manipulate the transaction. We offer Curtis's full cooperation in the current trust investigation in exchange for transactional immunity regarding the escrow transfer. It will protect Curtis, but it will guarantee that Mitchell goes to prison." I stood in my quiet kitchen, the receiver pressed cold against my ear. To save my son, I had to destroy his father. I had to hand the government the keys to the cell where my husband would spend the rest of his life. For 34 years, I had kept the secrets of this family, hiding the cracks in the foundation, painting over the mold, pretending we were safe. But the mold had reached the bones. "Do it, Mary Ann," I said. "I'll draft the disclosure tonight," she said. "I'll need Curtis in my office at 8 tomorrow morning to sign it. Can you get him there?" "He'll be there," I said. I hung up the phone. At 6 o'clock, the house was silent. Mitchell came down the stairs. He had changed into a dark green canvas jacket. his leather gloves tucked into his pocket. He was carrying 2 large suitcases. He set them by the back door, then walked into the kitchen where I was standing by the counter. He didn't look angry. He looked relaxed, almost cheerful, the way he did when he had finished a long, difficult closing and was heading to the club for a drink. He set his car keys on the counter, but they weren't the keys to his Lexus. They were the keys to my station wagon. "What are you doing with my keys, Mitchell?" I asked. "The Lexus is a firm lease, Lorraine," he said, pulling his leather gloves on, his fingers stretching the dark leather. "Donald Vance had the office manager remote disable the starter an hour ago. The plates are flagged as corporate property. I can't drive it." "So you're taking my car?" "The wagon is registered in my name, Lorraine," he said, a cold, mocking smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Just like this house. Just like everything else you think you own. I'm leaving tonight. I'm driving down to Maryland to stay at Robert Harris's cabin for a few days before I head to Savannah." "The Savannah townhouse is frozen, Mitchell," I said. "You can't close on it." "The escrow is frozen," he corrected, tapping the keys against his palm with a quiet plastic click. "But the developer is an old friend. He's holding the keys for me. I'll live there while the lawyers sort out your little filing. By the time Giles gets a court date, the audit will be finished, and Curtis will be in a federal holding cell. Let's see how much support you get when you're paying for his defense." He turned and picked up his suitcases. He didn't look back at the kitchen. He didn't look back at the dining room, where we had eaten 34 Thanksgiving dinners. He opened the back door, the cold wind rushing in, and walked out to my station wagon. I stood by the window and watched the red taillights of the wagon back out of the driveway, the tires crunching on the dry maple leaves, until the red glow disappeared behind the dark pines of Cedar Lane. He had left me stranded. I had no car keys. I had no passport. The temperature was dropping below freezing, and my son was scheduled to sign a confession at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, 20 miles away. I walked over to the kitchen counter and picked up my cell phone. The screen showed 2 unread text messages from Sylvia, but I didn't open them. Instead, I dialed Teresa's number. Teresa's headlights had barely swept across the kitchen window when a second pair of lights followed them into the driveway. It was Sylvia's small blue sedan. She got out of the car before the engine had even fully died down. Her coat unbuttoned, her face pale and pinched in the cold evening light. She slammed the door and ran up the back steps, bursting into the kitchen just as I was putting on my gloves. "Mom," she said, her voice cracking. She stood in the doorway, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. "Dad called me from the road. He said he's leaving. He said you're trying to put him in prison and that you're going to destroy Curtis's life. What is happening? Why are you doing this?" I looked at my daughter. The arrogant, dismissive tone she had carried on Sunday was entirely gone, replaced by the hollow, desperate panic of a child who had just realized the floor beneath her feet was dry rot. "Sit down, Sylvia," I said, pointing to the kitchen chair. "I don't want to sit down," she cried, her voice rising. "Curtis won't answer his phone. Brenda told me to go away. Dad is driving your station wagon to Maryland, and he sounded like a crazy person, Mom. He said Curtis was going to federal prison because of you. Teresa stepped into the kitchen behind her. She didn't say anything. She just closed the heavy wooden door, shutting out the freezing wind, and stood by the counter, a quiet, solid presence in her heavy wool coat. "Sit down, Sylvia," I repeated, my voice dropping into a low, steady register. This time she sat. Her knees seemed to give way, her body collapsing into the wooden chair. She stared at the kitchen table, her hands trembling in her lap. I sat across from her. I didn't hold her hand. I told her the truth. Starting with the $58,000, Mitchell had moved from the joint savings to the Savannah townhouse purchased under unmarried man, to the signature loans that used our home as collateral. And finally, I told her about the $40,000 in gambling debts Curtis had run up in Philadelphia 9 years ago, and how Mitchell had covered them using the firm's client escrow account. "He didn't save Curtis, Sylvia," I said softly. "He kept the records. He's using them right now to try to force me to withdraw my support petition. He was willing to let Curtis go to jail to save his own retirement." Sylvia stared at me, her mouth opening slightly, her eyes wide and blank, with a horror that had no words. "Dad did that? He embezzled money?" "Yes," I said. "But he told me." Sylvia's voice broke into a quiet, painful sob, her shoulders shaking under her coat. "He told me you were losing your mind, Mom. He said you were becoming paranoid like Grandma. I believed him because he was always so sure of everything. He bought my condo, Mom. He helped me with my student loans. I thought he was the one who was holding us together." "He was holding you hostage, Sylvia," I said. "He wanted you to believe I was weak, so you would help him put me in a box. Because as long as I was in the box, no one would ever look at his ledgers." She buried her face in her hands, her tears leaking through her fingers and spotting the dark oak of the kitchen table. It is a terrible thing for a child to realize that the parent who favored them didn't love them, that they were just a tool, a piece of leverage to be used against the person who actually kept them safe. "We have to go, Sylvia," I said, standing up. "Teresa is driving me to the city. Curtis is scheduled to sign a voluntary disclosure with the federal prosecutor at 8 tomorrow morning. It's the only way to protect him." Sylvia looked up, her face wet, her eyes small and red. She stood up slowly, her hands wiping her cheeks. "I'm coming with you. I'm driving." I looked at Teresa. She gave me a quiet, supportive nod. "All right," I said. "Let's go." On Wednesday morning, Mary Ann Giles' office was cold. The cast-iron radiator in the corner was clanking aggressively, letting out short, angry bursts of steam that smelled of wet rust. Curtis was sitting in the green leather wingback chair. He looked like a man who had spent the night in a cell. His eyes were sunken, his chin covered in dark stubble, his hands clasped tight between his knees. Brenda sat next to him, her hand resting on his forearm. Sylvia and I sat on the small sofa by the window. Mary Ann Giles walked in at 10 minutes to 8. She wasn't carrying her usual yellow legal pad. She had a thick blue folder under her arm, her face set in a grim, tight expression that made the air in the room feel instantly heavy. "Curtis," she said, setting the folder on her desk and looking at him over her reading glasses. "The voluntary disclosure is drafted. If you sign this, my colleague in the Federal Division We'll deliver it to the U.S. Attorney's Office in Pittsburgh by 9 o'clock. It will initiate an investigation into your father's escrow transfers, but it will secure transactional immunity for you as a cooperative witness. Do you understand? Curtis nodded once, his jaw tightening. I understand. All right. Marianne opened the folder and slid the document across the mahogany desk. She handed him a heavy gold pen. Curtis reached out. His hand was shaking, the tip of the pen hovering an inch above the signature line. Before the pen could touch the paper, the telephone on Marianne Giles's desk let out a sharp, loud ring. Marianne frowned. She didn't answer it immediately. She looked at the phone, then at me, before picking up the receiver. Marianne Giles, she said. For a long moment there was only the low, tinny sound of a voice speaking rapidly on the other end. Marianne didn't interrupt. Her face, which had been tight and professional, went completely still, her eyes widening just a fraction of an inch as she listened. I see, she said, her voice dropping into a low, quiet murmur. When did they find him? She listened for another 10 seconds, then nodded. Thank you, Donald. Keep me updated on the arraignment. She hung up the phone. The silence in the room was absolute, filled only by the rhythmic metal clanking of the radiator. Curtis' pen was still hovering over the paper, his eyes fixed on Marianne's face. Marianne looked at us. Her eyes lingered on me for a long, heavy second before she spoke. That was Donald Vance, she said softly. The state police stopped Mitchell on Route 48 near the Maryland border at 5 this morning. He wasn't driving to Robert Harris's cabin, Lorraine. Where was he going? I asked. He had 2 cardboard boxes in the back of your station wagon, Marianne said. They were the original partnership ledger files from '98. He had taken them from the firm's archives before he left. He was trying to cross the state line with stolen corporate records to burn them. He's currently in custody in Bedford County. Curtis didn't wait. The moment Marianne Giles finished speaking, the gold pen in his hand pressed down hard against the white paper. He signed his name on the line with a fast, heavy stroke, then turned the page and signed the second line. His jaw clenched so tight the muscle in his cheek twitched. He slid the document back into the blue folder and pushed it across the mahogany desk toward Marianne. He didn't look at his father's name on the cover. Is it done? He asked, his voice flat. It's done, Marianne said, closing the folder with a quiet, decisive snap. She turned to her intercom. Chloe, have David take the Miller disclosure to the U.S. Attorney's Office on Fifth Avenue immediately. Tell him to get a stamped receipt. She turned back to Curtis and Brenda. Go home. Curtis, do not answer your phone if anyone from the firm calls. Do not speak to the press if they show up at your house. If the state police contact you, you tell them you have a cooperative filing with the federal prosecutor, and you refer them directly to me. Understood? Curtis stood up, his hand reaching down to take Brenda's. Understood. Thank you, Marianne. They walked out of the office, their steps quiet on the Persian rug. Sylvia and I remained on the small sofa by the window, the radiator letting out a long, dying hiss as the steam subsided. Marianne Giles looked at me over her reading glasses. The state police will be transferring Mitchell to the Allegheny County Jail by this afternoon, Lorraine, because he took corporate records across state lines. It's a federal interstate transport charge on top of the corporate theft. Donald Vance is cooperating fully. He's terrified of what the auditors are going to find in those boxes. And the Savannah property? I asked. The developer has already canceled the contract, Marianne said, sliding a hand into her pocket. The moment the Georgia banks saw the federal injunction and the arrest record, they pulled the financing. The townhouse is gone. Mitchell's partnership share will be liquidated to cover the signature loans he took out against the firm's equity. He has nothing left to fight you with. I stood up, my knees stiff from the low leather sofa. Thank you, Marianne. You go home, Lorraine, she said, her voice softening just a fraction of an inch as she looked at my pale face. Get some rest. The next few weeks are going to be very noisy, but the foundation is secure. Sylvia drove me back to Cedar Lane. The car was warm, smelling of peppermint gum and the damp wool of her coat. The sky had turned a dark, heavy gray. The first small flakes of winter snow beginning to drift across the windshield, melting instantly into small streaks of water. We didn't speak until we turned onto the highway. Mom, Sylvia said, her eyes fixed on the gray road ahead, her hands gripping the steering wheel at 10 and 2. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I didn't believe you. It's all right, Sylvia, I said, looking out at the brown, frozen cornfields passing by. Your father was a very convincing man. He spent 30 years building an image of himself, and you wanted to believe in it. We all did. But I called you unstable, she whispered, her voice cracking as a tear slid down her cheek. I was going to help him put you in that medical center. I was going to let them say you were losing your mind. He was your father, Sylvia, I said softly. You thought he was the one who kept the roof over your head. You didn't realize I was the one holding the walls up. She didn't answer. She just reached across the console, her hand finding mine. Her fingers were warm, trembling slightly, and for the first time in 10 years, she didn't pull away when I squeezed them back. A daughter's reconciliation is not a sudden, dramatic embrace. It is the quiet, heavy realization that the mother she spent years dismissing was the only person who actually stood between her and the dark. When Sylvia dropped me off at Cedar Lane, the driveway looked empty without my station wagon. The Lexus was still parked in the garage, its dark windows reflecting the gray sky, a cold, expensive ghost that belonged to a firm that no longer existed for us. I walked into the kitchen. The house was cold, the radiator in the hallway clicking softly as the oil burner struggled to keep up with the freezing afternoon. I sat at the table and poured myself a glass of tap water. The silence in the house was absolute. It wasn't the suffocating, heavy silence of Mitchell's presence anymore. It was the quiet, hollow silence of a house that had been emptied of its secrets. At 3 o'clock, the landline phone on the wall let out a sharp, loud ring. I didn't hesitate. I stood up and picked up the receiver. Lorraine, a voice said. It was Donald Vance. His usual booming, executive baritone was gone, replaced by a quiet, cautious tone that sounded deeply anxious. It's Donald. I wanted to call you directly. The firm has been cooperating fully with the state police regarding Mitchell's arrest. Thank you, Donald, I said. We are. We are absolutely devastated by what we've found in those 98 ledgers, Lorraine, he said, clearing his throat. But the state police opened the secondary box Mitchell had in the back of your station wagon, the one he took from his private office safe before he left. He paused. I could hear the faint rustle of papers on his end, the sound of a man who was holding a document he didn't want to read. "What was in the box, Donald?" I asked, my voice very quiet, very steady. It was a set of private trusts Mitchell had established through a commercial bank in Wilmington, Delaware, Donald said, his voice dropping to a whisper. They were opened in 2012. They were funded using a series of offshore referral fees he had kept off the firm's partnership books. "Who are the beneficiaries, Donald?" Donald Vance let out a long, heavy breath. "They are in the name of a woman named Natalie Roy and a 10-year-old child, Mitchell Roy. He's been supporting them for a decade, Lorraine. The Savannah townhouse, it wasn't just a retirement property for Mitchell. He had registered a school enrollment application for the boy in the Chatham County School District starting next term." I stood in the middle of my quiet kitchen, the receiver pressed cold against my ear. The first winter snow was beginning to stick to the frozen grass of the backyard, turning the lawn into a sheet of white. Mitchell hadn't just been planning to retire. He hadn't just been planning to leave me with 5 years of grocery money. He had spent 10 years building an entire alternative life with another woman and a son who carried his name, while I sat in the drafty house on Cedar Lane, scrubbing his floors and waiting for him to come home. "Lorraine?" Donald's voice came through the line, tentative, anxious. "Are you there?" "I'm here, Donald," I said. My voice didn't shake. My hand was steady on the yellow plastic receiver. The final piece of the 34-year lie had fallen into place, and as I looked out at the white, freezing yard, I realized that the cold didn't hurt anymore. "I see," I said to Donald Vance. My voice was a flat line, carrying no anger, no shock, and no grief. The capacity for those things had been worn away over 34 years of quiet, systemic erosion. "Lorraine," Donald said, his voice hesitant, almost pleading, "the firm is going to settle your support claims immediately. We're going to buy out Mitchell's remaining equity to cover the signature loans, and the rest will be transferred directly to your private account. We can't have this go to a public trial. The Delaware trusts. We are dissolving his partnership share to distance ourselves from his personal liabilities." "Do whatever your lawyers recommend, Donald," I said. "Speak to Marianne Giles." I hung up the phone. I sat at the kitchen table as the winter snow began to coat the window pane, turning the glass into a thick, frosted screen. A 10-year-old boy named Mitchell Roy was starting school in Savannah next term. He would grow up with his father's name, perhaps even his father's sharp, arrogant chin, while Curtis' children played in a house that was currently being packed into cardboard boxes. Mitchell hadn't just built a retirement. He had built an entire second life, using the quiet, invisible labor of my first one to fund it. He had spent 10 years coming home to Cedar Lane, eating the roast beef I prepared, letting me iron his shirts, and sleeping in our bed, all while calculating exactly how to divide his heart and his ledger. I didn't cry. The tears belonged to a woman who still believed she had something to lose. 3 weeks later, the snow lay thick and heavy over the hills of Pennsylvania. The station wagon was back in the driveway. The state police had returned it after processing the stolen archives. Mitchell had tried to carry across the Maryland border. The keys were currently sitting in the small porcelain dish by the microwave, right next to my passport and my birth certificate, which Marianne Giles had recovered from Mitchell's locked briefcase. Curtis's suspension from the engineering board was official. 6 months of administrative probation. But he had kept his license. He and Brenda had stopped packing their boxes. They were staying in their house, Curtis working as a draftsman for a local utility company. His head down, his posture quiet and humbled. Sylvia was sitting on the living room sofa, her wool coat folded over her knees. She had spent the morning helping me pack the silver picture frames and the old linen napkins into a small cardboard box. She didn't check her phone once. "The movers will be here at 8 tomorrow, Mom," she said, her voice quiet and soft in the empty room. "I've already set up the utilities at the apartment in Gibson. It's small, but it has a beautiful view of the valley." "Thank you, Sylvia," I said, taping the top of the box shut. Do you want me to stay the night?" she asked, looking at me with a hesitant, hopeful expression. Teresa said she could drop off some soup. "No, dear," I said, giving her a quiet, reassuring smile. "I'd like to spend the night alone. I have some letters to write." She stood up slowly, her hand lingering on my shoulder for a long moment before she pulled her gloves on. "I'll be here at 7:30 tomorrow. I love you, Mom." "I love you too, Sylvia." I watched her drive away, her red taillights disappearing into the quiet falling snow of Cedar Lane. At 9 o'clock, the house was silent. I sat at the kitchen table with a single lamp lit, the rest of the house dark and empty. I had written 3 letters, one to Curtis, one to Sylvia, and a short note to Brenda. I didn't write to Mitchell. He was currently sitting in a federal detention center in Youngstown, awaiting his preliminary hearing on interstate transport of stolen property and bank fraud. He had called the house twice, but I had let the phone ring in the dark until it stopped. I opened my purse and pulled out the small blue leather passbook my father had given me when I was 18. The $4,000 was gone, spent on Marianne Giles's retainer. But the blue book itself felt heavier than it ever had. It was the only thing I had carried into this marriage that had remained entirely mine. I stood up and walked down the hallway to the front door. I didn't turn on the lights. I stood by the glass panel and looked out at the quiet, snow-covered yard. The maple tree I had watched for 34 years was bare, its black branches reaching up into the cold winter sky like fingers. My husband had once told me that no one would ever choose me again. He had believed that my graying hair, my stiff hip, and my decades of silence made me a woman who could be easily erased. A woman who would stay in her designated corner because she was too terrified of the dark to leave. But as I reached out and turned the brass lock of the front door, feeling the clean, freezing winter air rush over my face, I realized something Mitchell had never been smart enough to understand. A woman doesn't need to be chosen by anyone else to exist. She only needs to stop waiting for the person who doesn't see her to finally look up. I closed the door, the latch clicking home with a quiet final sound, and walked back into the kitchen to make a cup of hot tea in the quiet house that was no longer his.